The last line. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow through the underground bunker of New Eden's last military installation. Colonel Sarah Chen stared at the holographic display, watching as another human colony winked out of existence under the Nexari Empire's relentless assault. Her weathered hands gripped the edge of the tactical table, knuckles white with tension. "That's the third colony this week," Lieutenant Rodriguez reported, his voice hollow. "The Nexari are adapting to every strategy we throw at them. Their neural networks are learning faster than we can innovate." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of command press down on her shoulders like a physical force. 20 years of military service hadn't prepared her for watching humanity's final dance with extinction. The Nexari's biological warships, with their ability to evolve and adapt mid-battle, had systematically dismantled humanity's most advanced defensive systems. "Show me the deep archives again," she ordered, desperation driving her to search for anything they might have missed. As Rodriguez pulled up the classified files, an anomaly caught her attention. A power signature, faint but steady, coming from a section of the facility that shouldn't exist. "What's on sub-level 12? She asked, pointing to the reading. Rodriguez frowned. "Sub-level 12. Ma'am, this facility only has 8 levels." Sarah's pulse quickened. After 3 decades of military service, she'd learned to trust her instincts. "Get me a demolition team. Now." Hours later, Sarah stood before a massive vault door, its surface covered in decades of dust. The demolition team had cut through 3 layers of reinforced concrete to reach it. The security panel beside it still functioned, its soft blue glow a stark contrast to the emergency lighting above. "This facility predates the Nexari War," Sarah murmured, studying the old Earth government seal emblazoned on the door. What were they hiding down here? The security system, though ancient, yielded to her command codes. The vault door groaned open with a hiss of preserved atmosphere, revealing a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. Rows upon rows of cryogenic chambers filled the massive chamber, each containing a sleeping figure. But it was the military records displayed beside each pod that truly shocked her. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were legends, the most decorated veterans from Earth's bloodiest wars, preserved at the peak of their abilities. Sarah approached the nearest pod, wiping frost from its display screen. Inside lay Commander Marcus Walsh, the hero of the Mars Rebellion, his face peaceful in cryogenic slumber. The next pod contained Captain Elena Volkov, the woman who had single-handedly held the Jupiter line against the first wave of corporate warships during the Solar System War. "My God," Rodriguez whispered, reading through the facility's main terminal. This was Project Legacy. They took the best warriors humanity ever produced and preserved them for a day when they'd be needed most. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. The Nexari's greatest advantage was their ability to predict and counter modern military tactics. But these veterans, they were masters of warfare from a different era. Their strategies would be unpredictable, their methods unconventional by modern standards. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. 117, ma'am. All volunteers, preserved in the year 2145, before the standardization of military tactics and neural enhancement protocols. Sarah reached out, placing her hand against the cold surface of Commander Walsh's pod. The Nexari's computational warfare systems had been designed to counter modern military doctrine. They had no data on these old-style warriors, no way to predict the chaos they could unleash. "Begin revival procedures," she ordered, straightening her uniform. "All of them." Rodriguez paled. "Ma'am, these soldiers are from a different era. The psychological shock alone. The human race is down to its last 5 colonies, Lieutenant. In 3 months, the Nexari will have finished adapting to our remaining defenses. We're out of options and out of time." She turned to face him, her expression hard. "Sometimes, to save the future, you need to wake the past." As the revival protocols initiated, Sarah watched the vital signs of humanity's greatest warriors begin to stabilize. The war wasn't over. In fact, She realized as the first pod began its opening sequence, it was about to take a turn the Nexari would never see coming. The first ragged breath from Commander Walsh's awakening form echoed through the chamber like a battle cry from the past, heralding the beginning of humanity's last desperate gambit. Defiance rising. Commander Marcus Walsh's first steps in over a century were unsteady, but his eyes burned with the same intensity that had made him a legend during the Mars Rebellion. Around him, other veterans emerged from their long slumber, each moving with the careful precision of predators adjusting to new surroundings. "The year is 2247, Sarah explained to the assembled warriors, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Humanity is at war with an alien race called the Nexari. They've destroyed Earth and most of our colonies. We have 5 remaining strongholds, and we're losing them one by one." Elena Volkov, still adjusting her borrowed uniform, spoke first. Her voice carried the sharp edge of a tactical mind already at work. "Show us their combat footage. All of it." The holographic display filled the room with scenes of recent battles. The Nexari's biological warships moved with impossible grace, their organic hulls adapting mid-combat to counter human weapons. The veterans watched in silence, their expressions growing darker with each devastating defeat. "Their ships are alive," General James Ironclad Chand observed, his cybernetic eye whirring as it analyzed the footage. "But they're not just biological. Those movement patterns, they're running combat algorithms, predictive systems." Walsh stepped forward, his scared face illuminated by the holographic carnage. "That's why you woke us. Your modern tactics are too clean, too predictable." Sarah nodded. "The Nexari's neural networks can analyze and counter any strategy taught in our military academies. But you all fought before the standardization of combat doctrine. Your methods are primitive," Elena offered with a dangerous smile. "Chaotic. Effective," Sarah corrected. "We need that chaos now more than ever." The room fell silent as the veterans processed the magnitude of their situation. They were relics of a more brutal era of warfare, awakened to fight an enemy that had merely perfected the art of modern combat. Walsh moved to the tactical display, his fingers tracing the current battle lines. "Your weapons are more advanced, but the basics of war never change. Show me what we have to work with." The next 12 hours were a crash course in modern military technology. The veterans absorbed everything with remarkable speed, their experienced minds adapting decades of combat knowledge to new tools. But it was their questions that gave Sarah hope. They asked about things no modern soldier would consider, seeing opportunities where others saw only standard protocols. "These neural dampeners," Elena mused, examining a piece of standard issue equipment. "They're meant to keep soldiers calm under fire, yes. We won't be using them." "The dampeners help prevent combat stress and trauma," Rodriguez protested. "They also dampen instinct," General Chen countered. "And instinct is what keeps you alive when everything goes to hell." Walsh assembled them in the hangar bay, where rows of sleek combat shuttles waited. The veterans moved with increasing confidence, their bodies remembering rhythms of war that no cryogenic sleep could erase. "We'll need to modify these ships," Walsh announced. "Strip out the targeting computers. We'll aim manually." Rodriguez looked horrified. "That's impossible at modern combat speeds." "Impossible is what the enemy expects," Walsh replied, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "That's exactly why it'll work." Sarah watched as the veterans began transforming the modern vessels into hybrid machines that better suited their unconventional methods. They disabled safety protocols, removed predictive targeting systems, and reconfigured weapon mounts for manual control. "They're going to get themselves killed," Rodriguez whispered. "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged. "But they'll do it on their own terms, in ways the Nexari can't predict. And that's the only advantage we have left." Elena approached her, now fully dressed in modified combat gear. The legendary defender of the Jupiter line carried herself with the same fierce grace that had once turned the tide of the solar system war. "Your modern military tried to remove the human element from warfare," she said softly. "But that's precisely what the Nexeri learned to counter. We're going to remind them why humanity's chaos was once feared throughout the solar system." Walsh called for attention, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles. "We have 3 days to prepare for our first strike. The enemy thinks they know every move humanity can make." He looked around at his fellow veterans, seeing the same deadly determination in their eyes. "Let's show them how wrong they are." As Sarah watched the veterans prepare for war, she realized they weren't just planning a military operation. They were orchestrating a symphony of controlled chaos that would either save humanity or end in glorious disaster. Either way, the Nexeri were about to face something their perfect predictive systems had never encountered. The unpredictable savagery of humanity's finest warriors, unleashed from the past with nothing left to lose. The war was about to change, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of hope as she watched these legends prepare for one last dance with destiny. Operation Ghost Strike. The void between Jupiter and Saturn erupted in chaos as Commander Walsh's retrofitted fleet dropped out of hyperspace directly inside the Nexeri patrol zone. Modern military doctrine called such a move suicidal. The space was too tight, the margins for error non-existent. But Walsh had fought the Battle of Deimos in quarters just as tight, with technology far less forgiving. "Hard burn on my mark." Walsh's voice crackled through the comm systems, stripped of modern filters and encryption. "Just like we practiced. Raw and dirty." Elena Volkov's squadron hung back, their modified fighters running dark. The Nexeri's massive bioships, elegant in their horror, immediately began shifting their organic hulls to counter the expected human attack patterns. Their neural networks had already calculated every possible approach vector used in the last 50 years of space combat. Walsh smiled. They hadn't calculated for what came before. "Now," he roared. 20 ships fired their engines simultaneously, but not in the precise, coordinated patterns of modern combat. Each veteran pilot burned their engines with different intensities, creating a chaotic scatter pattern that resembled a wounded fleet in disarray. It was the kind of desperate maneuver that had been drilled out of modern pilots for being too risky, too unpredictable. The Nexeri ships hesitated for a crucial second, their adaptive algorithms struggling to predict the humans' next move. That hesitation was all the veterans needed. "Showing them some old Earth hospitality," General Chen growled, his ship spinning in a maneuver that would have triggered every safety protocol in a modern vessel. His manually aimed shots struck a Nexeri vessel's sensory cluster before its biological armor could adapt. The battle dissolved into the kind of close-quarters brawl that hadn't been seen since the Solar System War. Veterans who had once fought through the asteroid fields of the belt now wove between Nexeri ships with the same wild grace, their unpredictable patterns confounding the aliens' combat computers. Elena's squadron struck next, emerging from their dark, running with a technique she had perfected during the Jupiter Line crisis. Her ships accelerated and decelerated at random intervals, creating the strobe-like effect that played havoc with the Nexeri's tracking systems. "Their ships are trying to evolve countermeasures," Rodriguez reported from the command center, watching through long-range sensors. "But they can't predict which patterns to adapt to. There's too much chaos." Sarah watched the tactical display with a mixture of horror and amazement. Modern space combat relied on precise formations and calculated risks. This was warfare stripped down to its primitive core. Ships weaved through debris fields that no modern pilot would dare approach, fired from angles that violated every principle of modern combat theory. "They're falling back," Walsh announced, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Elena, show them your special trick." Elena's squadron launched a barrage of modified missiles, another remnant of old-style combat that had been abandoned for more civilized weapons. The warheads split apart mid-flight, releasing clouds of metallic chaff that played havoc with the Nexeri's organic sensors. "Biological ships," Elena transmitted. "Meet good old-fashioned metal poisoning." The Nexeri fleet's coordination began to break down as their neural networks struggled to process the seemingly random actions of their human opponents. Their biological ships, accustomed to adapting to patterns, found themselves unable to counter attacks that followed no discernible logic. "This is madness," Rodriguez whispered, watching as veteran pilots executed maneuvers that should have torn their ships apart. "This is how we used to fight," Sarah replied, understanding finally dawning, "before we let computers tell us what was possible." The battle reached its crescendo as Walsh led a final charge directly through the heart of the Nexeri formation. His ships moved like drunk dancers, each following their pilot's instincts rather than tactical algorithms. The Nexeri's adaptive hulls, trying to respond to multiple threat patterns simultaneously, began to show signs of systemic failure. "All ships, hit them with everything," Walsh commanded. "Show them what human chaos looks like." The veterans unleashed a devastating barrage, their weapons firing in a discordant symphony that overwhelmed the Nexeri's defensive calculations. Ships that had evolved to counter the precise patterns of modern warfare found themselves torn apart by attacks that came from impossible angles, with impossible timing. When the radiation cleared, the Nexeri patrol fleet was in ruins. Humanity had won its first significant victory in years, using tactics that had been considered obsolete for a century. But as the veterans regrouped, their ships bearing scars from maneuvers that no modern vessel was designed to survive, Walsh's voice came through the comm with a tone of grim satisfaction. "They can predict the future of warfare all they want," he transmitted, "but we're going to show them its past, and sometimes, to win the future, you have to reach back into history and remember what made humanity a force to be reckoned with in the first place." Sarah looked at the tactical display, where the remaining Nexeri ships were retreating in disarray. For the first time since the war began, she saw genuine hope. The veterans hadn't just won a battle, they had shattered the Nexeri's fundamental assumptions about human combat capabilities. The war was far from over, but humanity had just reminded the galaxy why they had survived countless disasters, wars, and catastrophes. Not through perfect calculation or flawless execution, but through the beautiful, terrible chaos that lived in every human soul. The price of victory. Deep within the captured Nexeri vessel, Belina Volkov stood before a pulsing organic console, her scarred hands hovering over its living tissue. The ship's interior resembled a massive cardiovascular system more than a traditional spacecraft, with walls that breathed and corridors that seemed to digest their presence. "The ship's trying to adapt to our presence," Dr. Maya Santos, the team's xenobiologist, reported. "But it's confused. Our biosignatures don't match anything in its database." Walsh moved forward, his boots making soft squishing sounds on the organic deck. "Because we're not enhanced. No neural dampeners, no emotional suppressors. We're running hot and human, just like our ancestors." The discovery had come at a devastating cost. 3 veteran squadrons lost in the taking of this vessel, their sacrifice buying humanity its first glimpse inside a Nexeri capital ship. But what they found changed everything they thought they knew about their enemy. "It's not just that they predict our tactics," Alina said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the neural interfaces. "They predict our emotional responses, modern soldiers with all their enhancements. They're too stable, too predictable." Dr. Santos nodded, her hands moving across her diagnostic equipment. "The Nexeri ships are designed to counter emotionally regulated opponents. They expect measured responses, calculated risks. But you veterans, we're unstable," Walsh finished, a grim smile crossing his face. "Unpredictable. Our fear, our rage, our desperation, it makes us volatile." Sarah Chen's hologram flickered in the ship's humid atmosphere. "That's why they targeted Earth first. Our homeworld was where we kept our history, our primal nature. They wanted to erase what made us human." The revelation hung in the air like a physical weight. Humanity had spent centuries trying to perfect warfare, to remove the messiness of emotion from combat. In doing so, they had made themselves vulnerable to an enemy that turned predictability into a weapon. But the veterans' success had revealed a crucial weakness in the Nexari strategy. Their biological ships, for all their adaptive capabilities, couldn't process the chaotic nature of unaugmented human combat. Each victory by Walsh's forces had sent ripples through the Nexari fleet, their neural networks struggling to compensate for strategies that defied mathematical prediction. "We can win this," Elena said softly, her hand resting on the organic console. "But the cost." Walsh understood. The veterans' bodies were already showing signs of strain. Fighting without modern enhancements meant feeling every G-force, every impact, every moment of terror and triumph. They were burning through their lives at an accelerated rate, their aging processes kicked into overdrive by the stress of combat. "How long?" Sarah asked, her holographic form flickering with concern. Dr. Santos consulted her readings. "At this rate, most of them have weeks, maybe months. Their bodies can't sustain this level of stress without modern medical intervention. And if we accept those interventions, we become predictable again," Walsh concluded. He looked around at his fellow veterans, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had made them legends in their own time. "We all knew this was a one-way trip when we volunteered for the Creo program." Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of command that had once held the Jupiter line. "We need to teach the next generation. Show them how to fight with their hearts as well as their heads. The knowledge can't die with us." The plan came together quickly after that. While one group of veterans continued to engage the Nexari in increasingly chaotic battles, others began training young pilots. They taught them to disable their neural dampeners, to trust their instincts, to embrace the controlled chaos that had once made humanity the terror of the solar system. But the cost was mounting. Each day brought news of another veteran lost, not just in combat, but to the sheer physical toll of fighting without modern medical support. They were burning through decades of life in weeks, their bodies paying the price for their unprecedented success against the Nexari. "We've located their primary neural hub," Walsh announced during a strategy session, his face notably more lined than it had been weeks before. "A biological supercomputer that coordinates their entire fleet. If we can destroy it, their ships will lose their adaptive capabilities," Sarah finished. "But the defensive screen around it is calibrated against modern warfare doctrine," Elena interrupted. "We'll hit it old school. One final push, with everything we have left." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A suicide mission, but one that could turn the tide of the war. The veterans would burn out their remaining lives in one massive assault, using their very unpredictability as a weapon against the Nexari's perfect calculations. Walsh looked around the room, at the faces of men and women who had already given everything for humanity once before. "Who's in?" Every hand raised. There was no hesitation, no calculation of odds, just the pure human determination that had carried their species through its darkest hours. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her hologram seeming to dim, "for reminding us what it means to be human." Walsh nodded, then turned to begin the preparations. The final battle would begin soon, and with it, humanity's last, best hope for survival. They had already sacrificed their past by waking from cryo sleep. Now they would sacrifice their future to ensure humanity had one. The price of victory would be paid in full by those who had already given everything once before. Legacy of the old guard. The Nexari neural hub loomed before them, a massive organic structure that pulsed with alien intelligence. Around it, hundreds of bioships moved in perfect formation, their patterns so precise they seemed to mock the chaotic human fleet advancing toward them. Commander Walsh sat in his command chair, feeling every one of his years in his aching bones. The past month had aged him decades, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had made him a legend during the Mars Rebellion. Around him, the remaining veterans piloted their ships with reckless grace, each knowing these would be their final hours. "All ships, check in," he commanded, his voice rough but steady. "Ready," Elena responded, her squadron moving into their deliberately irregular formation. "Awaiting your order, General Chen added, his voice weaker than before, but still carrying that iron determination. One by one, the veterans reported in. Their voices were tired, their bodies failing, but their spirits remained unbroken. Of the original 117, only 43 remained. The others had burned out their lives in a blaze of glory, teaching the Nexari the true meaning of human unpredictability. Behind them, a new fleet waited. Young pilots trained in the old ways, ready to carry on the legacy of chaos and instinct that had given humanity its edge. Remember, Walsh transmitted to all ships, the hub's defenses are calibrated to predict and counter any logical attack pattern. So we're going to do something completely illogical. Elena's laugh crackled through the comm. One last dance with madness. The attack began not with a coordinated strike, but with what appeared to be a complete breakdown in fleet cohesion. Ships scattered in seemingly random directions, each veteran pilot following their instincts rather than any discernible strategy. The Nexari defense grid hesitated, its predictive algorithms struggling to process the apparent chaos. Now, Walsh roared. The veteran ships suddenly ignited their modified engines, creating a dazzling display of radiation and chaos that overwhelmed the Nexari's sensory systems. They'd stripped their vessels of every safety protocol, pushing ancient engines far beyond their breaking points. The first line of Nexari defenses fell to attacks that came from impossible angles, fired by pilots who ignored every rule of modern space combat. The bioships tried to adapt, their organic hulls shifting and evolving, but they couldn't predict the unpredictable. We're through the outer perimeter, Elena reported, her ship leaving a trail of burning plasma as its overtaxed engines began to fail. But the inner defenses will be our legacy, Walsh finished. He opened a channel to the young pilots waiting behind them. Watch closely, children. This is how humanity used to dance among the stars. What followed would be spoken of for generations to come. The veterans, their bodies failing and their ships falling apart, orchestrated a symphony of destruction that defied every principle of modern warfare. They flew through their own explosion debris, used dying ships as impromptu missiles, and turned the very chaos of their assault into a weapon. The Nexari neural hub's defenses, designed to counter logical attacks, began to break down under the strain of processing so many unpredictable variables. Its biological computing systems, overwhelmed by the sheer randomness of the human assault, started showing signs of systemic failure. The hub is vulnerable, Dr. Santos transmitted from the command center. But the pathway, it's suicide. Walsh looked at his tactical display, where a small gap had opened in the hub's defenses, a gap that would close in seconds, and that led straight through a field of destructive energy that would tear any ship apart. Elena, he called, remember that crazy maneuver you pulled at Jupiter? The one they said was impossible. She laughed, the sound full of life even as her body failed her. Ready when you are, Commander. Together, they drove their ships toward the gap, ignoring the warnings of their failing systems. Behind them, the remaining veterans provided cover fire, each fighting with the desperate creativity that had made humanity a force to be feared before the age of predictable warfare. For Earth, Walsh transmitted, for all we were and all we could be again. Their ships, burning from the inside out, pierced the Nexari's final defenses. The hub's biological surface loomed before them, its neural pathways pulsing with alien intelligence. Walsh and Elena's vessels, more wreckage than spacecraft now, carried their final payload, a virus designed to turn the hub's adaptive nature against itself. The impact was spectacular. The hub, trying to process and adapt to the pure chaos of the human attack, began to devour itself. Its neural networks, overwhelmed by the unpredictability of the assault, collapsed in a cascade of biological failure. Throughout the system, Nexari ships suddenly lost their adaptive capabilities. Their perfect formations dissolved into confusion as the controlling intelligence that guided them dissolved into chaos. Sarah Chen watched from the command center as the next generation of pilots moved in, applying their newfound understanding of controlled chaos to finish what the veterans had started. The Nexeri, stripped of their predictive advantages, found themselves facing a humanity that had remembered its true strength, the beautiful, terrible unpredictability that had carried them to the stars. Days later, when the final reports were filed, the cost was staggering. Not a single veteran had survived the assault on the hub. They had burned through their remaining years in minutes, pushing their bodies and ships beyond any reasonable limit. But they had given humanity something far more precious than victory. They had given them back their legacy. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt. But they never again forgot the lesson taught by Walsh, Alina, and their fellow veterans. Military academies began teaching both precision and chaos, technology and instinct. Humanity had learned that their greatest strength lay not in perfecting warfare, but in embracing the unpredictable spirit that had always defined their species. And in quiet corners of space stations and colonial outposts, pilots would raise their glasses to the old guard, the warriors from the past who had taught the future how to be human again. The stars belonged to humanity once more, and they shone all the brighter for the chaos that lived within their light.